episode 14 of International Expansion Explained. My guest this afternoon is Michael Maeder, who is really what I would call the epitome of a global citizen because born in China, he's German by origin and has worked in 6 different countries spread over 2 continents. He's a partner of August Leadership and co founder of IoT One, a global IoT consulting practice. He's got more than 15 years' experience in executive search. And whilst he initially focused on Asian markets, being based in Shanghai, and then moved into a global role based in Munich, covering C suite, general management, regional and country heads, as well as functional head positions for clients in consulting, industrial, technology, consumer, and life sciences. He's studied international business and international management, has worked in supply chain consulting, and has founded 2 award-winning consulting and professional services companies in China, focusing on both the industrial and tech sectors. He later founded IoT One, or co-founded it, which is a market leader for structured market intelligence for industrial IoT. And he's also written or co-written the book Human Resources in China. He's additionally a China ambassador for the German Chancellor Fellowship of the Humboldt Foundation and has in the past served on the board of directors of the German Chamber of Commerce in China and co-founded the German Young Leaders Organization in Shanghai. Michael, thank you for taking the time to join me today. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone.
Maybe you can just tell us, how did you, with a profile like yours, I guess it was almost preordained that you went into something international, but how did you arrive at the point that you're at today in your international business career?
Yeah. In my bio, you alluded to this already. You could say it was made very easy for me to enter into an international career. As you mentioned, I was born in China, in Macau, to be more specific. Actually, my parents emigrated from Germany first to Hong Kong, then Macau, then later to China, like 44 years ago. Then later, after a corporate career, my dad then, together with my mom, founded an own company and actually a garments production business in China, and built the business from there. Through that, naturally, I had an affinity already for China and Asia more broadly, and also through my further education in Germany. I was brought up at boarding school, also a very international environment, and later on studied in the Netherlands, also with a couple of stints abroad, both work and study assignments in different places. That's actually how it all happened. With my parents being entrepreneurs, I also had this entrepreneurial gene already, you could say. And then I met my business partner at business school in the Netherlands, and we both went to China, actually originally thinking this would only be for 3 weeks or so to explore potential business opportunities, and then come back to Europe, and then explore our options. We never came back to Europe, actually. We then happened to stay in China. And I just came back, moved back to Germany then 3 years ago, where I'm now based out of Munich.
So you grew up trilingual, or?
I grew up with, my mother tongue, of course, being German. I grew up with Cantonese. So I was also still in preschool and kindergarten in a Cantonese-speaking school. My Cantonese nowadays is pretty poor, actually. So it's also not that important, quite frankly, in China, particularly if you live in Shanghai. It's more focused on Mandarin. So Mandarin is really what I'm aspiring to learn, really. It's a language you lose, unfortunately, very quickly once you leave the country. So I'm still trying to stay up to date, do Chinese classes every week. But it's a struggle if you're not living in the country to really retain that know-how.
Yeah, that's very true. This struggle is very real. I experienced that. Not that I have fluent Mandarin by any stretch of the imagination, but with French, with Russian, and I've been trying to learn Mandarin as well, then it's really quite tough.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was thinking you could be actually the speaker on this as well. I mean, your background is quite international, or maybe even more so. I mean, with these different combinations where you have lived and the type of places that you have seen.
Yeah, some odd places as well, but yeah, I mean, but I think for a lot of people, this idea of having a very international career, it sounds like a dream job, and I personally would say it definitely is a dream job because it's something that, you know, that I've been doing for the last, well, ever since I graduated university practically. So, yeah, quite a few years now. Um, but it's not all about exciting travel and exotic food. It comes down to a lot of other skills that you need. So what if we just starting out, what would you say are the basic skills that a young person needs to develop in order to start being considered even for any kind of international roles?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, I agree to what you said. I mean, an international career and working internationally is extremely rewarding and enriching. So I would recommend it to anyone, really. But I also think that the requirements for talent in terms of skill set required for an international career have really tremendously increased over the last 2 decades that I've been in that business. I mean, if I look at the type of talent in terms of qualifications that they bring into the equation 20 years ago compared to nowadays, um, it is quite clear that the level of professionalism, the level of basic skill set, and the expectations there has increased substantially. And this goes into language, this goes into digital dexterity, this goes into cross-cultural intelligence, this goes into business acumen. So I think 20 years ago, take China as an example. I mean, this was really like the pioneer stage, right? Pioneer phase. China was still a little bit exotic at that time. So you would have many individuals going to China, like adventurers really, that didn't have any meaningful qualification except for a bit of Chinese that they've picked up, maybe trained in Germany or somewhere in the US, often starting as an English teacher and then going from there. But if I compare it to the requirements nowadays to really have a stimulating and aspiring international career, the requirements have definitely gone up. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is the complexity of running an international business has just increased. So the requirements to an individual to operate effectively there have increased. But also the skill set of homegrown talent has improved. I mean, taking China again as an example, I mean, nowadays there is hardly any gap between talent grown in China, like native Chinese, in terms of both raw, obviously in terms of raw talent, there is no difference. But in terms of education, in terms of also the career paths that they have seen, the development that they have seen. So you really have to bring more to the table if you come in as an international, as a non-home or as a non-international for that specific market to really be effective.
Yeah.
But we have a large population of what we call flexpats, individuals, for instance, nowadays in China, that is a large group of really highly professional international talent, very well trained, strong language skills, and everything that it really takes to be effective. But I think the bar has really increased.
I think I would agree. I mean, when I started out after uni, when I went into my first exporting job, let's say, then I brought in a qualification. To an English job, I had an Austrian qualification in export and international business, and I don't think actually that the company even looked at that I had that. The reason I think that they gave me the job was the fact that they'd been bought out 6 months earlier by a French aerospace company, and nobody in the company spoke good French, and so they wanted somebody who had French as a first foreign language to manage the business with the French colleagues. And
Hmm.
it was, you know, and the fact that I then had other export qualifications, that was like an added bonus. But if you think about it, I was taking care of markets like French speaking Africa and things like that, where, you know, there was no kind of IT requirement because you were lucky if you could get a phone call home during the week
Well,
if you were there. So
exactly. Yeah. And even if you look at a generation back, when my dad was first sent to China by a corporation, the Quelle Group in Germany back then, and he was only selected based on one criteria, that he has a mix of experience with hardware products and textile products. So that was the reason why he was sent abroad. He barely spoke any English to Hong Kong at that time, and had any really broader set of qualifications that would have made him succeed in that market. I mean, eventually it turned out that he had a natural affinity for this, and it all worked out well. But if you look at it, how the company back then selected him to actually go abroad was purely based on really technical expertise rather than anything else.
I mean, to be honest, that's how a little bit of how I ended up in Asia as well, because I was selected. I was already in the company, and when a colleague left, the quotation from my then boss, who you also know, was, "Well, your English is better than ours, and I'm sure that you will understand the English in Asia better than we will. Off you go." And
I can imagine.
and I didn't expect it to click like it did, you know? And I think that when that happens, then that is really one of those beautiful moments. But it's also that question of what are the personality attributes of somebody who goes into a market. If you're selecting somebody for international, what kind of personality attributes do you need? And are those more important than those kind of hardcore product knowledge kind of skills? Because I think that these days that product knowledge or that company knowledge, that's kind of a hygiene factor, isn't it? It's taken for granted that you know about your product, but you have to be a certain kind of person to work well in an international environment, at least for longer than a couple of months.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, good point. First of all, I believe that indeed personality or maybe mindset matters more than anything else. I would say. I mean, if you really look at technical skills, particularly nowadays, the shelf life and the half life of technical skill is so short compared to the past, that it's 5 years later what you learned back then might not even be relevant anymore, right? So really, what matters nowadays, particularly in an international career, is transferable, more endurable skill sets, general affinities, and experiences that really matter. And I think international experience is a good example. I mean, that's not something that you can pre-program. That's something where you really have to learn it through trial and error. That's not textbook type of knowledge that you can acquire. So this is really transferable, and this is durable as well. So this is still meaningful even decades later. But I believe personality, in particular mindset, matters most. And I think if I had to sort of distill it down to one attribute that really matters, it's curiosity. And how would I say this? And maybe also a certain thick skin and ability to accept differences. Because particularly for us Germans, this sometimes can be hard. We tend to think black and white, and if you're particularly in Asia, things are not black and white very often. And if you're not curious to actually explore those differences and really enjoy those differences, even so, if you're looking for the same, right, that doesn't make sense to go abroad. And this connects also to this cross-cultural sensibility. It's not something totally different. Actually, curiosity is a big part of that. So I would say that's probably the key. I mean, everything else, I think you can be introvert, you can be extrovert. Obviously, if you're extrovert, it's easier for you to connect often. But I don't think that these are the things that make a difference. I think if you're genuinely curious, that helps you to really be a FEF outside your own home country.
Yeah, I think that being genuinely interested in the country that you're visiting, even if you don't always like everything about it, but being generally interested why it is or how people celebrate whatever is their local festivals and so on, that's always, people feel whether or not you're genuinely interested in them or if you're just trying to sell them something, don't they? It doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you're genuinely interested and open to hear about a different culture, then people feel that. And
Right.
not that you just have a list and you tick the
Right.
questions. Oh, I asked him, are you okay? Okay, we tick this off. That's the small talk done. That's the German approach, right? Okay. How are things?
Yeah.
Let's get into
Exactly.
it.
And I think the other side feels this very quickly, right? The authenticity around this. And if it comes across authentically and really deep felt, I think this gets you a long way. And then it's really also enriching, right? So it's not tiring, it's not you don't burn energy, but it's actually energizing. And I think that's actually how you can really spend, because being abroad also means you're not at home, you're often outside your comfort zone. You don't have the comfort of everybody speaking your language, being where the whole rest of the family is, having all this support network. So there's a cost to being abroad, right?
Yeah.
And if this energizes you, this curiosity, I think then you don't burn yourself, but even on the contrary, it gives you more. It really enriches your life.
And I think it's also that difference of, there are people who take overseas postings in the sense of they go and they spend maybe 6 months, but it could be also 3 years in a country and they really live there for that time. Or there are people who, I mean, I've lived abroad for almost all of my working life, but I've not lived in the countries that I've been traveling to for work, if you see what I mean. I've spent most of my working life now in Austria, but actually I've spent probably 50% of that time, or at times maybe 70 or even 80% of that time, traveling and in other countries. And that's also, that kind of doing short trips is also a different kind of feeling to if you actually based in a country and you can really immerse yourself in the place.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. I'm what you just explained, the experience that you've had, I have now in the last 3 years, where I'm again starting to travel into places, whereas before I really lived in China for like 14 plus years. It's a different experience. Actually, if you travel, sometimes you even feel it's more intense, because you're actually more conscious in the way how you spend your time, right? And you're
Yeah.
more aware than if you actually live there and it's your day to day. Within, let's say, your trip, 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so, and you do this several times, right? So you have this augmented and additional learning every time you go back again, to reevaluate certain assumptions that you have made and so forth. So I think it's even more intensive sometimes than if you permanently live in another place.
And if somebody is looking to, says, okay, I would like to have a career in international business, would you recommend that they try to find a, let's say, a company in their own home country who are exporting and work in that field for a couple of years? Or would you recommend that they start out in whichever market they might like to go into, and that they go and locate themselves in that market so they can learn the language, or maybe they're teaching English and then look for a job from that point?
Yeah, I think that first strategy that you described would have been probably the right approach 20 years ago, when this was more still the exception for companies to recruit somebody with an international profile outside his or her home country, right? But I think nowadays companies, particularly larger multinationals, but even the larger mid caps or startups, particularly startups actually, have become so used to recruiting, no matter where they're based, people from different nationalities, bringing them together. So it's almost part of their DNA. So I don't think it's necessary nowadays to really find your job in your home country and then go abroad. Of course, that has a certain comfort to it. Very often, if you're sent abroad as an expat, there's benefits, really financial benefits that go along with this as well. But sometimes I think it's even good to get outside of that comfort zone, because I think that's when you often have a different experience, and you learn about the place differently. So if you start looking actually for a job in a new location, this is already a learning curve, right? So you learn a lot about that new location during that search process. And I think it has become so easy, right, to also find and so diverse in terms of the channels that you can access. I mean, you have LinkedIn, obviously. You have the job board, international ones like Indeed, Monster. But then you have, and I think that's the difference compared to still a few years ago. You have really this professional subcultures. I'll give you an example. You have these startup communities in different countries, like Startup Grind as an example. They have chapters in every city, and these are extremely international sort of organizations, very welcoming, coming in and out. People are coming in and out, so it's very natural to really dock onto these organizations and then explore. By the way, entrepreneurial endeavors. I mean, Catherine, you have done this now yourself in the recent years, right? So moving from a classical corporate job into an entrepreneurial setting. I think that's also a good way to go international. So it's one of the options. So sometimes depends also on the type of business that you're operating. Some are easier to operate if you're a national from another country. So if you come into a place not as a national from that country, whereas other businesses that might be more difficult. But that's an option I think a lot of people don't even see, because it sounds so absurd. You go into another country and you set up a business. To a lot of people that sounds odd, right? But these days a lot of people actually do that. And in organizations like Startup Grind, these startup communities, and I'm choosing this as an example. You have this in any. I mean, one of my colleagues here in Munich, she's from Shanghai, lived in Mexico for a long time, and then moved recently to Germany. I mean, she connects through her yoga. She's a yoga teacher and connects through the yoga community. And actually through that, she found her apartment. She found really also professional relationships. She starts doing yoga classes now here as well. So as a trainer, that's also a subculture in itself, right?
Definitely. And I think that that's also, it's also in any new country, the way of connecting is to look at what you're interested in, look at what you're good at doing, and to look for other people who are doing that. And like you say, there are some places that are renowned for their startup culture, like maybe Israel or, some tech hubs or so on. Shenzhen is one of those kind of tech hubs that you think about.
Exactly.
Those kind of things. But yeah, so Tatiana asked us the question, what you do, how should you best go about demonstrating that you're the right kind of person for an international career during the recruiting process? If you've got some qualifications that are relevant, but I mean, I would say from own experience, at least in the past, it was often that question that as a woman, people looked at you and they were not so keen to send you abroad, or at least they considered that it's maybe not so easy as with a guy. It might not be outspoken in that way, but it's at least a consideration,
Yeah, and I'm quite sure it's true what you say. In the past, this was an issue, but I think nowadays, I think it's less of an issue. I mean, recruiting is always, you look at a candidate always through quite a multi-dimensional lens, right? So there's always a bucket of requirements that you have. So it's hard to really say like this is the one sort of universal requirement. I mean, there are a few things generally will help you be effective internationally in a business context. I mean, curiosity being one of these, right? Things, but that's obviously not enough. Depending on the role, you need a certain mix of technical qualifications, functional qualifications, soft skills, managerial skills that are being looked at. And the more senior the role is, the more specific the requirements might be actually, or the more multifaceted the type of requirements might be. Whereas if you're a graduate and you start your career internationally, that's a different story. I guess the biggest mistake that most companies make is that they recruit for technical skills rather than these other factors that actually play even more important role, like mindset, like personality. I mean, I'm a little bit careful with the term personality because that almost means to a lot of people, it sounds like you need to be a certain personality in order to be effective. But that's many roads lead to Rome, right? Therefore, it's more about mindset, values that you bring into the equation than really personality, because an introvert and an extrovert can be as effective in doing something. So it does not necessarily say anything about the effectiveness on a job. But I think very often companies overemphasize the technical criteria and too little weight the lot of transferable experiences, transferable skill sets, things like mindset, soft skills, and so forth.
And do you have some, let's say, some advice as to how people could gain experience that could be useful to them? I don't know. I mean, in Austria, for example, there are often the opportunity to do internships with the international chamber, not with the international, but with the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, with their own section and so on, which gives a very broad kind of view of what particular markets are like and the kind of problems that exporters have, actually, if you're looking at doing international markets. So
yeah, I mean, for graduates, I feel nowadays it's relatively easy, right? So the most intuitive vehicle is an internship, really, to go abroad. And you're right. Actually, the chambers of commerce, for instance, I've served on the board of the German Chamber of Commerce in China. I mean, these are very influential organizations in these countries. I know the Austrian Chamber of Commerce as well, very well, and they even have job boards that are specialized on target groups like this, so that would specifically offer jobs targeted at international candidates coming to China. For graduates, I feel it's relatively easy. I mean, if you're an experienced professional, I guess it takes a little bit more daring, and you might have to sometimes go a little bit more unconventionally about this. But I guess the big advantage is that in this day and age, the economy has become more flexible, more agile in terms of how to employ individuals, right? So this buzzword, the gig economy, right? Yes. Project-based work. So I think it's not unheard of nowadays, even as an experienced professional, that you approach a company and say, like, look, I have a certain skill set that I bring to the table. I'd love to do something internationally for a few months. Can I do? And it might not be called an internship. It's a project-based assignment. So that's actually very viable. And I know many examples where this has been the starting point towards an international career. Or you do a project even within your own company. So I think very often I do see that that's sort of the light way of getting into the international experience is to leverage your own organization that you're currently working with and see whether they have any opportunities, and maybe to be a little bit flexible. If they say, like, okay, we don't have anything in China, but we have something in the US, then why not go to the US? I mean, or any other place for that matter. So I guess the first step to really go outside is already a step in the right direction very often.
Definitely. I mean, I think that when you're starting out, you have probably more options open to you because everything is interesting or everything is relevant. But I guess once if you're 15 or 20 years into your career, you've kind of got more to lose, or you've got a family that you also have to consider, that you say, well, I wouldn't consider going to that market because I can't ask my partner to leave their career. or it's difficult to move the kids at this time. There's always a reason to make it more difficult, aren't there? The further you get into your career, it becomes more complicated, I think.
No, that's very interesting that you say this, and we have observed the same. In addition, also part of what I do in my daily work, I mean, executive search is recruiting senior executives right into positions. But we have an offering which we call executive career sparing, where we advise senior executives on a career pivot. And I've done this really throughout my career life with young graduates up to very seasoned sort of battle-hardened executives. And what we have observed is very interesting, an interesting phenomenon, which I think is worth mentioning. If you compare a young graduate with somebody who's more an experienced professional, and the more experience, the more severe this becomes actually, in terms of how they view their options to further develop their career. You will see that the graduates have really sky's the limit type of an attitude. So everything is still an option, almost too broad. So the options are so broad that they get lost in this optionality, and they are getting lost actually in this. So we have seen that a lot. Whereas experienced professionals really think of their options in a very narrow and a linear manner, which partly is driven through factors like family, so things that cause you to become more risk averse. But even beyond that, it's very often just your experience becomes a liability. Your legacy becomes really contained. And that's interesting, actually. And we have looked at how can we break that up? How can we help these individuals really take, again, more of a blue ocean type of an attitude towards their career? When it comes to such a pivot. We call it a career pivot. So it's like a real shift in your career that is not really linear in terms of this is what you do now, you do this next, which is a very continuous sort of an approach, but really doing something different. And we have realized what helps to transcend really your current situation is to make a more abstract assessment. And looking at three things fundamentally. First, your strength. But not in a very narrow manner. So if give you an example, if you say like my strength is sort of typing or analyzing spreadsheets, then we might say like, okay, this is maybe too narrow of a definition. Let's bring this to a different layer of abstraction. My strength is deep numerical analytics, just as an example. And there's different ways of actually driving this to a different level of abstraction. So to get bird's eye view on your strengths and not to narrow it down to what's my sector, my specific function, but a more of an abstract skill level. The second one is to look at affinity. So what drives me? What really engages me? What gets me up in the morning and what really excites me. And I'm not talking fun. I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about work, it's about fun. I don't think fun is the right terminology. I think what energizes you, really, when you come home from work, you don't say it has been fun, but you haven't felt that it was working. It was like you were doing exciting stuff and it really stimulated you. And to really find out what that is, that excites you, so your drivers, you could say, and then you look at broader market trends. What are things that are happening where my strength, where my affinities can be put to good use? Whether this is digitalization, whether this is geopolitics, whatever is the relevant trend in this particular universe where you see yourself evolving. And what we have realized going through that layer of abstraction. Also experienced individuals become much more open-minded. They actually start looking at alternatives they have never viewed before, and they also take it into that direction. And we have seen beautiful stories actually evolving from this.
That's really interesting. And I can fully understand that if you get to, let's say, a mid-career perspective or a senior level perspective, you're kind of already quite a long way. It's like going down a funnel, isn't it? And you feel a little bit like you're stuck with your arms at your sides in the track that you've been working in probably for the last 10 years. And it's really hard to think out of the box in that kind of a situation. Even if
right.
It's one thing to say, oh, I'm open for change. but I think your brain just doesn't give you this picture of what that change could look like in a
Yeah.
realistic scenario. It's
And maybe if you summarize it also in an attribute, I said curiosity before. Maybe another C could be courage.
yes,
And the more experience you get, I think the equation would be down goes your courage to do things that are really outside that domain.
yeah,
With everybody, and that I think that's or with most people. I don't claim to say what happens with everybody, but I see this across the board. And courage is something. It's like a muscle. It's something that you can train and also learn.
definitely. And I mean, do you feel that companies have become also a little bit more courageous in the way that they are recruiting their teams? I know that during the pandemic, a lot of companies realized, because of the let's say work from home opportunities, that they didn't have to have all of their staff recruited in their own backyard, and that they in theory could have more freelancers. But do you think that the way that companies recruit international staff has changed in the last couple of
Yeah.
years?
Absolutely. I mean, overall, definitely say there's a positive trend. I mean, more recently, also due to geopolitics, I guess it's fair to say there's a bit of a deglobalization trend ongoing, which also impacts how open companies have actually become recruiting international talent for markets. But overall, I think definitely across the last 20 years, the trend was definitely positive. But you also have to segment this a little bit in terms of what type of companies. And I think there's fundamentally four target groups. One is large multinationals. I think for large multinationals, moving around international talent is daily business. I think it's really and many of these companies actually go through interesting cycles. So they at some point are very international. They move talent around very assertively, and then again they have these cycles of where they recruit locally for leadership positions as well, and they de-emphasize the international piece again. But overall, I would say large multinationals do this already for a very long time. Then you have the SMEs. So many of them are really international, very international organizations in their own rights, right? With a few thousand people internationally. They very often still struggle with the logistics around this. So they actually like to do this, but they might not have the policies in place yet to be really effective in this. So that's sometimes a bit of a bumpy road. But they actually, many of these companies also have an affinity for this and they want to do it. Might not be as professionalized as large multinationals are doing this. But even among those, you have some that are more conservative. They say like, I only recruit locally for local, also due to cost reasons often, or it might also be a philosophical assumption that they say like, we assume that local talent understands the local situation, the local context better, and by virtue of this are also more effective. Even though I would challenge that assumption generally, but you can't forbid that thought, right? So that does happen, and it seems intuitive on first sight. Then I think you have this whole new target group of new. I'm talking really in the last 10 years that has evolved the startup scene. I think the startup scene, recruiting internationally is really second nature. Even if you talk to Chinese founded startups in China, like founded by a Chinese, they would even nowadays already start looking at international talent from day one. So you could say they're born global. Actually, they have never been a local company because very often driven by the founder who bring in that international mindset. They have never had that constraint of not recruiting internationally, and that's a very large pool of potential employers these days. And then there's the standard local the more conventional local companies, many of which look at recruiting international talent very often with a very mandate. So I see, for instance, Chinese company, and I'm using China as an example, but I see that in many other markets. I mean, I've just spent most of my life really in China, right? And there, typically Chinese companies would recruit, so not startups. I mean, I'm talking really more conventional companies. And they would look at recruiting international talent with a very clear, specific task. So, for instance, to manage to manage the export business, or to do business development with international accounts. Very often quite opportunistic about why and how they recruit international talent. So it's really a bit of a different view depending on the company, and it also depends on the geography. I mean, there are certain geographies where it's just much harder, both from a policy standpoint and regulation standpoint, to recruit international talent, and where it's just less commonplace, and the logistics are just much more difficult. Where it's much more difficult, the barriers of recruiting international talent is just harder. But I believe you really have to segment a little bit what type of employer you're actually talking about.
And what do you see as being the most frequent mistakes that companies make if they're recruiting internationally? Do they look for international people to fulfill the wrong positions, or what are the biggest challenges that they have in getting that right?
Yeah, I guess the working with international talent is really a long-term, long play. The mistake that you can make is hiring for skills rather than these transferable issues that I've spoken about, like mindset and attitude, and also values that somebody brings into the equation. So if you emphasize the wrong thing in your specifications, then this can lead you to make horrible mistakes. I think that's one. And hiring for job descriptions rather than looking at more holistically, what is the type of capabilities that I want in my organization? What is the type of people that I want in my organization? And startups have become pretty good at that, actually, to transcend an individual job description and to say, and I'm saying startups and generalize this a little bit. I mean, some startups do better job as this than others. But to really take a people-centric approach to recruiting and saying, like, what are your strengths? What do you bring to the table? And how can we really create the platform for you to unleash your potential, and then let you fly in an ideal world. I guess the biggest mistakes that companies can make is hiring for hard skills and for job description, rather than taking really a people-centric, human-centric approach and saying, like, what are your strengths? What are your affinities? What is the potential you bring to the table, and how can we unleash this? I guess that's, very often companies don't realize that this is a mistake, because this does not result in a catastrophe, but it results in mediocre performance, right? It results in people not bringing the best potential to the workplace. So very often this doesn't materialize. But as an outsider who's a little bit experienced with observing these things, and in my line of work, that's part of my job. You see this very quickly, what type of philosophy and mindset the company applies towards recruiting talent, and not just international talent for that matter, because a lot of what I said applies also to talent that you hire within your own geography.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've observed it often that, building on that point you made about the job description, that actually the company is kind of solving the problem that they've had in the past, especially if they're replacing somebody. So they have a job description, which is whatever the last person was doing, and to solve the problems that they had up until now, rather than actually maybe looking forward 3 years into the future and thinking, okay, what do I actually need this person to be able to do? What are the skills that they're going to need moving forward to actually probably grow the business or move the department forward in whatever way, depending on what the position is.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I think they define the specifications by looking in the rear mirror, but they should be looking actually in the
Yes.
front shield, right?
Yes. That's a little bit how I felt often in the past few years when I've looked from the outside at how things are being done. So
yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Particularly in an international context. Even though we have business plans in place, but the more you move into an international arena with your business, the more unpredictable everything becomes, right? So at some point, defining hard skills for a job that you don't even know will happen in 1 year from now. So by virtue of this, you would naturally and intuitively say like, okay, then let's focus really on what's transferable, like learning agility. By the way, extremely important. If you really want to look at what is an innate skill and ability, learning agility is probably one of the biggest one out there, and because that really enables you to deal with different challenges that you might not be able to predict nowadays. So you're totally spot on there.
thank you. I think we're coming a little bit to the end of our discussion. I'm sure I could continue asking you questions for hours and hours, but that would explode the time frame that we set for ourselves today. A couple of questions that I like to ask all of my guests at the end. Which resources do you wish that you had when you were starting out on your international journey? I mean, I know technology has moved on in the last years, of course, but generally speaking, which resources would have been more helpful if you'd been able to tap into those?
I mean, in all fairness, I've been quite privileged actually in terms of getting access. So it has been made very easy for me to get into an international career, and I think many people start from a different foundation into an international career. Actually, it was just until I came back to Germany 3 years ago that I realized international experience, real international experience, so not just having been abroad, doing a bit of holidays internationally, but real hard earned and type of international experience is still a scarce resource. And I always thought this was out there in abundance, but the reality is that's not true. And maybe this was a naive belief on my end, but somehow this is what happened when I returned to Germany. I realized actually it's still a scarce resource, at least in countries like Germany. I think there are different countries like Sweden or the Netherlands where this is different. They just have generally a different international mindset and affinity to go abroad, these trader nations in particular. So I guess specifically because I started off as an entrepreneur, what would have been a great resource are organizations like Startup Grind, that these communities, these subcultures that you have, this whole network and facility wasn't out there when I started off. So I really went through a trial and error process, getting started with my own business, which was extremely painful here and there. Also quite rewarding, but I think a lot of this learning I could have saved with an organization with a landing pad like that. But other than this, I mean, the opportunities were all out there. Education was there. I guess I would say that's probably the key.
Maybe just at the end, I mean, I took out of that also that you see it as being something valuable, that people spend some time abroad and maybe come back into their home market to bring back those skills, those transferable skills that they've learned. It's also can be a valuable experience for any individual, I think, to do that. But maybe just to close up, you'd like to tell us a little bit more about what services it is that you offer and who should reach out to you to maybe work with you if somebody's listened to this conversation and they're thinking, that is exactly the kind of support that I need to help me move forward with my company. Which kind of clients are you working with generally?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks, Catherine, also for having me. By the way, this was really a stimulating conversation, and I think it's an interesting topic actually to explore. In terms of a service that we provide, I mean, I work for an executive search company, executive search and leadership consulting company. In broad strokes, we are a global organization headquartered in New York. The organization is called August Leadership. We are a bit of a disruptor and innovator in our market, actually also growing quite fast. Globally, around 150 professionals, 50 partners in the organization. And we are an integrated executive search and leadership consulting business. So the executive search side of our business means basically placing and recruiting senior leaders. So this can start from headquarter-based positions. This can be in-market roles, country heads, regional heads, global BU heads. This can be functional head roles. So that's typically what we do across all sectors. So we are pretty much a full-service firm. I myself focus traditionally more, or not traditionally, but typically more on technology-savvy businesses. So I do a lot of work in the high-tech space, in the industrial space. I also do some consumer work. I mean, you still recall we was working together, right? When you were with HIP, this was in the consumer space. So I've also, in terms of sectors, worked in many sectors already and serviced many sectors. But this is sort of the my sweet spot in the market is technology and innovation savvy organizations. But we have also this other piece to our business, which is the leadership consulting part, which is the smaller piece to our business. Somewhere like 10% plus of our revenue is in that space, where we also provide solutions around management assessment, for instance, executive career sparing. What I mentioned earlier, that's something that we also offer to senior executives. Yeah, it's not a huge money earner, and we actually I almost often say actually we don't do this for the money, but we do this for the passion. Is that type of work, which is non-executive search, so non-recruiting related. I mean, I'm also passionate about executive search, but that's also very financially rewarding. But the consulting part of our business, that's something you really need to be passionate about in order to do it and enjoy it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It has been an absolute pleasure to catch up and to have a discussion on the things that you are, let's say, specialized on, rather than to be focused on a transactional job to be done, as has been the case in our previous exchanges. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody who turned up. Kate, thank you. Amici, thank you for the comments. I've seen that there's quite a lot of interesting comments in there. And Tatiana, I hope you found it useful. And we will be back again soon with another episode of International Expansion Explained. Yes. Thank you and have a great
afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Catherine.